Hello.
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 What are we talking about today?
I think we're talking about magic.
Woo!
1, 2, 3, 4.
In his most famous work, The Golden Bow, the anthropologist James Frazer outlines a theory that is embedded in colonial discourse, detailing how human thought evolved from savagery to civilization in 3 stages: magic, then religion, then science. For Frazer, who wrote in the turn of the 20th century, magic existed in the ignorant and superstitious classes of modern Europe, and among the lowest savages surviving in the remotest corners of the world, while science was seen to be at the peak of human rationality. What is problematic about this narrative?
So, what's problematic with the magic religion science trajectory is the same thing that's problematic with most colonial narratives. And that is, it forces a linear conception of time and space in order to fit the colonial project and the colonial invasions at the peak of a linear trajectory. But as far as magic is concerned, this forced linearity implies that magic ended when religion began, or that what remained of magic was somehow unaware of religion, like these people didn't know better, or were like on the peripheries of civilization. But magic was practiced alongside religion and lent a lot of its practices to religion. A lot of religious ceremonies and prayers and rituals are magical. But the separation was installed as a social and political delineator so that the religious institution can basically outline the borders of its jurisdiction.
Would you say that the moment in which magic becomes organized, then, in the same way that religion is organized, that's when magic becomes co-opted by religious thinking?
The organization aspect of magic, I think, makes it into a cult. But that is also a social delineator because religion wants to remain higher in the hierarchy of organizations, so it would call organized magic a cult. But for all intents and purposes, a cult is a religious institution.
What would you say is a more accurate description of magic?
So this was the comparison between magic and religion. And I think before we go into the more accurate description of magic, we can discuss it in relation to science first. The word science is in many ways a placeholder for rationality, right? Because it was part of that Enlightenment thinking project and installing rational scientific methods. Rationality came about to exclude both religion and magic, and in doing so, it claims a right to legitimize what isn't an acceptable way of understanding the world. So it's about structures of knowledge, how you come about knowledge, and what is deemed a acceptable way to attain knowledge and what is deemed an unacceptable way to attain knowledge. And here, magic is, as far as science is concerned, an unacceptable way to attain knowledge because it is unintelligible. And there's a distinction here between knowing and understanding. And magic is a way of knowing. It is the way of attaining knowledge of things that are not explainable or understandable in a scientific method worldview. From here, we can approach like a more accurate description of what magic is. And there are many definitions of magic. Different approaches try to define magic differently. The description that I work with describes magic as a pursuit of unintelligible knowledge, to put it very concisely. This is a summary of a description of magic that's found in Ghayat al-Hakim, or the Picatrix in English, where magic is described against the ability to comprehend or make sense of causation. And it treats knowing and understanding as two distinct things. So in Arabic, those two words would be al-ilm versus al-fahm. And knowing is attainable, but understanding is not attainable within magic. And the pursuit of that knowledge is then the actions that creates a magical practice. And that is where the craft lies. That is where craft and witchcraft comes from. It is an active state of pursuing knowledge that is ununderstandable.
In your article, Finding Saturn, Experiments in Tech Magic and the Boundaries of Work, you write, the legal persecution of practicing magic did not become a systemic part of law enforcement until capitalism was established as a state-allied and church-backed economic system in Europe. So, at what point was the practice of magic banned in Europe?
Before the point at which magic was criminalized in the legal system in Europe, practicing magic was already not permitted within older, previous religious systems. It was a way for the religious institution at the time to mark the territory for its jurisdiction over people's souls, in a way. And it was a means for subjugating local populations, and that was the case with most marginalized groups and with slaves, and when Europe eventually went to the New World. The earliest magic-related crime was maleficium. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. Which is defined as a magical act intended to cause harm to people or property. And this was part of the legal Roman code and was later made a part of the law in Europe in the 7th and 8th centuries. And it was a reaction against what was referred to as the fear of the Saracens at the time of the Arab conquest of the Levant and the threat of them coming into Europe. Because of the promise of slave freedom within the law of Islam, and due to associating Arab tribes with sorcery, slave descent was framed as maleficium and attributed to magical thinking, and magical thinking became associated with social harm and harmful intent. So that was quite early on. The witch trials, which were a much more organized, logistically lubricated, systematic process, they were not until the 15th century. That was the peak of the witch hunt. And that was a good 600 years later. So during the 15th century, most legal treatises on witchcraft were written. And the church was publicly describing witchcraft as a threat. And it was in the mid-16th century that the law was passed on to the secular courts.
Question. If that's the case, does this mean that the religious institutions believed in the power of witchcraft and also saw that power as satanic, maybe?
Yes. Maybe this is important to clarify because I would assume it was a given. But yes, it was framed as satanic, which in a way keeps it in the ecology of the religion because Satan is part of most religions. Specifically Christianity, and Christianity was the religious body that propagated all of this. So it was attributed to satanic practice and blasphemy, and as we'll see later, that extended to social harm. But it didn't really matter, by the way. It didn't really matter whether witchcraft was real or not, whether magic was real or not.
Did those practicing witchcraft see it as witchcraft?
That's a really good question. Actually, most of the crimes described as witchcraft at the time of the witch hunt were not necessarily even magic. It's a little bit impossible that hundreds of thousands of people, specifically poor women, all of a sudden, in tandem, started practicing magic. And this is where the line blurs between the actual practice of magic and the social and sociopolitical problem of magic.
What was the rationale?
So to answer the question of rationale, what was the rationale behind these laws? I think let's just take a minute to describe the intellectual sphere of Europe at the time. There was an intellectual sphere. This was not a religiously feverish time. Philosophers like Thomas Hobbes, Bacon, Kepler, Galileo, Shakespeare, Pascal, Descartes, they were all active during this century. And this time was the time that what then became called the birth of modern science and scientific rationalism. So the debate of whether or not magic was real was a popular subject among intellectuals, and they would emphasize that, of course, it is not. However, they all would still support its criminalization as a moral means for social control. And that says a lot about these men. So as far as rationale goes, social control was a good reason as any, especially as the law moved from the jurisdiction of the church and onto secular courts. This very much became very outwardly about social control, and less about questions of belief.
How does this relate to capitalism?
Here is where the work of Silvia Federici is really important, because she offers an investigation into the history of the witch hunts in the context of how the structures of economic production and labor were changing at the time, and the resultant social shifts that were necessary for that economic change. It is a little absurd to think that the extent of bloodshed that happened in the name of the witch hunt was exclusively morally and politically driven, especially that now we know retrospectively just how much economically profitable colonialism was and how much wealth was extracted from the New World and from the colonies. So saying that social control was the rationale only goes so far. It's not untrue, but it doesn't describe the full picture of just why so much control was necessary. So she does a more material analysis on the motivating factors behind these laws and ties it really well to reproductive labor. That is essentially what it comes down to. Because as the witch hunt persisted, the gender and social class of those accused of witchcraft was overwhelmingly poor women. It's not like only poor women have practiced magic in history. Some of the most well-known magicians are men. So in terms of the legal criminalization of magic, understanding why it became so widespread and violent requires looking at it in the context of the priorities of the state at the time. And it was a time where reproductive labor, aka making babies, was essential for creating human capital, aka more workers. And that was seen as a resource. It was a material resource that needed to be controlled. So the accusation of witchcraft often involved things like the killing of babies and sucking the blood of babies, offering babies as sacrifices to the devil, and things like that. And you would be suspected of that if you resisted being the baby-making machine that capitalism required at the time. So, and because this was essentially about sexual freedom, this period in history created associations to magic that carried on in time. It tied witchcraft to reproductive bodies and sex and sexuality. And I believe that these associations are hang-ups from that time in history, because the focal point of magic is not actually sex or sexuality so much as it's made out to be. But I do think that there is a tie between witchcraft or magic and capitalism, because capitalism falls under the realm of rationality and scientific and technological progress, which is what we spoke about at the beginning. magic is a way of knowing the world, and that is at odds with the way that capitalism knows the world.
The main thesis in Adorno and Horkheimer's Dialectic of Enlightenment is that technological advancement, in conjunction with the Enlightenment, had produced oppressive forms of governance, predicated on efficiency, performance, and rational-based thinking. Do you see the interaction between magic and technology as an alternative to the intersection between capitalism and technology, and the way the latter drives technology to a certain direction?
Yes, absolutely, exactly. I think that the connection that capitalism made with technology was one possible timeline that we have taken, and the connections that magic can make with technology is an alternative timeline. So in that sense, magic fits into the discussion about capitalism as an alternative route, not as a reaction to.
What are the intersections between magic and technology?
So because capitalism has overtaken most of what technology does, what I needed to do for my research is to strip it down to a very low level of what technology is. And that meant going down to the source code of technology, of software. And now we're talking about technology as in digital technology and software, not as in any kind of tool in the world as technology. This is a very specific technology. And on that level, technology and magic are essentially worlds that are built from syntax. And that's the basic parallel and relation between them. Tech is based on organized language in code, and magic is based on describing the world in language. And a world can be built and therefore changed and acted upon by invoking certain language. The way that code executes processes on a machine is the same way that prayer can get you what you're asking for, and it's through spelling it out. And that is why spell books are called spells. It comes from spelling. Yeah, so that's the basic overlap between magic and technology. It's in the mechanics. It's in the structure of how a world is built. And that does not include capitalism.
Where does your own work fit into this, and how did you come to magic?
I came to magic through technology. So not from a humanities or anthropological perspective at all. I was researching algorithms that explore the possibility space of a structure. At the time, I wasn't looking into magic at all, but what that led me to is a niche of mathematics called combinatorics, and it's the study of arranging, rearranging, and finding different combinations and orders of different elements within a given set. There will be more links about this in the description, but it's essentially a recreational field of mathematics. The only applicable field where this is used is, I think, cryptography is the one I can think of now. And following that thread of research, I came upon a lot of puzzles that use combinatorics as a way of solving mathematical puzzles. And one of those things, one of the older puzzles was magic squares. And magic squares eventually ended up guiding most of my practice, both my artistic practice and magical practice, which I started to cultivate 2 years ago when this research began. And there will be links in the description to this video where you can read more about my work.
Thank you.
Thank you.